Nobody on the 47th floor paid any attention to the man mopping the hallway that night. Nobody except a failing system worth millions of dollars that an entire engineering team had already surrendered to. While the rest of the building had long gone dark and the parking garage sat half empty, a man in gray coveralls knelt beside a locked control panel, his hands sticky with industrial cleaner, his eyes reading the blinking cascade of error codes the way a surgeon reads a vital sign monitor. The security camera in the upper corner of the server room recorded the moment without judgment, recorded him isolating the fault, recorded him typing, recorded the exact second the system exhaled and steadied. By morning, the chief executive officer of Ardent Systems would review that footage 3 times in a row. Then she would ask a single question that would send a tremor through every floor of the building. Who is the cleaning guy? Elias Carter was 38 years old, and he had been many things before he became the man people stepped around on their way to the coffee machine. He had grown up in Spokane, the kind of kid who took apart the family microwave at age 10, not out of mischief, but out of pure, burning curiosity about why the turntable motor had started making a grinding sound. His mother called it a gift. His 7th grade shop teacher called it a vocation. By the time he finished a degree in electrical engineering at the University of Washington, the industry had a more precise word for it: talent. Not the rehearsed, credential-polished kind that fills a resume with familiar logos, but the instinctive, structural kind, the ability to look at a complex system and sense where it was lying to itself. For 9 years, Elias had been a lead systems engineer at a mid-sized automation firm called Vantex Technologies. He had designed energy routing logic for industrial facilities across the Pacific Northwest, written the kind of documentation that junior engineers bookmarked and returned to for years. He had been good at the work the way some people are good at breathing naturally, without performance, without needing anyone to confirm it. He had also been, during those years, a husband. Rachel had been a landscape architect with a laugh that filled rooms and a habit of leaving trail maps on the kitchen counter the way other people leave grocery lists. She died of a fast and merciless illness when their daughter Lily was 3 years old, and after that, the world Elias had built around the two of them shrank down to just one small person who needed him to keep standing upright. Lily Carter was 7 now, with her mother's eyes and her father's habit of asking questions about everything. She was the kind of child who understood more than she let on, who would sit quietly in the back seat on the drive to her after-school program and say things like, "Dad, I think you're smarter than most people," with the absolute certainty of someone stating a fact, not offering a compliment. She believed in her father the way children believe in gravity, not because anyone had explained it, but because the evidence was simply everywhere around her. Elias never corrected her. He also never told her about the last 2 years. The collapse at Vantex had not been his fault, though his name had been attached to it with the ruthless efficiency of institutional self-preservation. A senior vice president named Garrett Moss had pushed through a cost-cutting modification to a control system Elias had originally designed, a modification Elias had opposed in writing. Twice, when the modification caused a cascade failure during a client demonstration, Moss had moved quickly, cleanly, and without apparent conscience. Internal reports were revised. Timestamps were adjusted. By the time the investigation concluded, Elias Carter's professional record carried a notation that prospective employers read the way they read a criminal background check, with immediate, quiet disqualification. He had spent 14 months applying. 14 months of callbacks that stopped after the reference check, of interviews that went warm and then went silent. He had depleted most of the savings Rachel's life insurance had left him. He had moved he and Lily from a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill into a smaller place in a quieter part of Seattle, where the rent was manageable and the neighbors did not ask too many questions. The night cleaning position at Ardent Systems had not been his plan. It had been a Tuesday when he saw the posting, a cold afternoon when Lily's shoes were a size too small, and the power bill had the orange envelope look of a final notice. He had applied online, been called the same afternoon, and started the following Monday. The hiring coordinator had not run an engineering background check. There was no reason to. He was mopping floors. Ardent Systems occupied the top 14 floors of a glass tower on 3rd Avenue in downtown Seattle, and from the outside, it looked like the future. Inside, it was Building 1. The company had spent the past 4 years developing an artificial intelligence platform called Atlas, an adaptive thermal and load allocation system designed to manage energy distribution across large commercial and municipal infrastructure. The contracts already signed were worth, collectively, somewhere north of $300 million. The contract's pending signature depended entirely on a successful live demonstration scheduled for 6 weeks out. Every engineer on the Atlas team knew this. Most of them had not slept properly in a month. The night Elias Carter first noticed the problem, it was a Thursday in mid-November, and the server room on the 47th floor smelled like warm plastic and quiet desperation. He had been running his standard route hallways, restrooms, the small kitchen off the engineering bay when he passed the server room door and heard the sound. Not an alarm, not a beep, something subtler. The irregular rhythm of cooling fans cycling at inconsistent intervals, a mechanical hesitation that should not have been there. The door was ajar. Through the narrow gap, he could see the status board mounted on the far wall, a grid of green and amber indicators with one persistent cluster of red in the lower left quadrant. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding his mop, and looked at the pattern. He recognized it. Not the specific system, he had never worked with Atlas, but the shape of the failure. The signature. It was the kind of error that looks like a hardware problem until you realize it is a logic problem. The kind that junior engineers chase for days because they are looking in the wrong layer of the stack. He stepped back, pulled the door closed to its original position, and continued his route. The engineering team had been working on it for 72 hours by that point. The crew rotated in shifts. Though the shifts had begun to blur, people were sleeping on office couches, ordering food in bulk, filling the whiteboards with increasingly elaborate fault trees that grew more baroque and less useful with every passing hour. The Atlas platform had developed what the team was calling a logic loop in its primary energy distribution module, a recursive condition in which the system's load balancing algorithm would trigger a safety check that would interrupt the load balancing algorithm, which would trigger the safety check, which would the engineers referred to it, in the bleary shorthand of the severely sleep-deprived, as the loop that ate itself. The CTO, a precise and increasingly irritable man named Marcus Webb, had brought in 2 contractors from a consulting firm on the West Coast. They had reviewed the codebase for 18 hours and delivered a report recommending a full rollback to the previous stable build, a process that would take 3 weeks and effectively kill the demonstration timeline. Marcus had rejected the report and sent the contractors home. He was not ready to say the word rollback to Victoria Hale. Nobody who worked for Victoria Hale was ever ready to deliver bad news to Victoria Hale. She had founded Ardent Systems 11 years ago from a shared workspace in Belltown, with $22,000 in personal savings and a business plan she had revised 47 times before she stopped revising it, started executing it. She was 42, sharp-featured, and possessed of a stillness in high-pressure moments that some people found reassuring and others found deeply unsettling. The stillness of someone who has already processed the problem 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the plan, room, and is simply waiting for the facts to catch up to her. Conclusion. She wore no jewelry except a thin, white gold watch on her left wrist, and spoke in sentences that contained only the words she needed. She had built her company on a single operating principle. Ability is real, and everything else is noise. She did not know Elias Carter existed. On Friday night, at 11:47, Elias finished the kitchen and the 2 conference rooms on 47 and returned to the server room. The door was closed now. The badge he had been issued for janitorial access hung from a lanyard around his neck. He pressed it to the reader, heard the magnetic latch release, and walked in. The status board was worse. The red cluster had expanded. The cooling fans were louder. He set his cart outside, propped the door open with a rubber wedge, and walked to the secondary workstation in the corner, a terminal that was logged into a monitoring console rather than the main development environment. Used by the IT team for diagnostics. It was not the system. It was a window into the system. He sat down and began reading logs. He did not rush. He worked the way he always had, methodically, horizontally, following the data without forcing it toward a conclusion. The error timestamps told one story. The resource allocation records told a slightly different story. The discrepancy between them was small, almost invisible. But Elias had spent 9 years learning to notice small and almost invisible things in complex systems. The fault was not in the primary load balancing module. That was where everyone had been looking, and that was precisely why no one had found it. The fault was in a secondary optimization routine that had been added to Atlas 6 months earlier, a performance enhancement patch designed to reduce the system's response latency. The patch had been written cleanly and worked perfectly under normal operating conditions. Under high-load conditions, however, it introduced a timing conflict with the main module's safety check interval. The two processes were stepping on each other at the exact moment the system most needed them to cooperate. The loop was not eating itself. It was being fed by something no one had thought to look at. Elias understood this with a clarity that felt, in that moment, almost peaceful. He did not have administrator credentials. He did not touch the production environment. What he did instead was use the diagnostics terminal to write a temporary routing instruction, a manual override that rerouted the optimization routine's timing call through a buffer sequence that prevented the conflict. It was not a fix. It was a splint. A precisely placed, structurally sound splint that would hold the system stable until someone with the proper credentials could perform the actual surgery. He typed for 4 minutes. He tested the instruction twice. Then he executed it. The status board changed. The red cluster contracted, amber by amber, until the lower left quadrant was entirely green. The cooling fans settled into a smooth, even hum. The recursive loop stopped. Elias sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he stood up, pushed the chair back to its original position, walked to the door, removed the rubber wedge, and let the latch close behind him. He retrieved his cart from the hallway and continued down to the 46th floor. The security camera mounted above the server room door had recorded all of it. Victoria Hale arrived at the office at 6:15 on Saturday morning, as she did every Saturday, and found Marcus Webb waiting outside her door with an expression she had learned to classify as something happened that I do not understand. The overnight monitoring report showed that the Atlas loop had resolved at 11:51 the previous night. No engineering team member had been in the building after 11. No remote access had been logged against the main development environment. The system was stable, more stable, in fact, than it had been at any point in the previous 72 hours. "I have no explanation," Marcus said. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Get me the camera footage." She watched the server room recording alone, in her office, with the door closed. She watched Elias sit down at the diagnostic terminal. She watched him read. She watched his hands move across the keyboard, unhurried, deliberate, with the specific economy of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and felt no need to perform the knowing. She watched the status board change. She watched him leave. She rewound the footage and watched it again. Then she watched it a third time. She pressed her intercom and said 2 sentences. "Find the person in this footage. Do it this morning." The facilities manager had Elias Carter's name, employee number, and home address within 40 minutes. By 9 o'clock on a Saturday, a message had been left on his phone asking him to come in Monday morning, not for his cleaning shift, but to meet with the executive team. He showed up in the same gray coveralls he wore every night. Because he did not own a suit anymore, he had sold the last one 18 months earlier, along with most of the furniture from the Capitol Hill apartment. Victoria Hale's office occupied a corner of the 48th floor, with floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides and a view of Elliott Bay that on clear days extended to the Olympic Mountains. She was standing when he was shown in, and Marcus Webb was seated to her right, and two other engineers Elias did not recognize were against the back wall. Nobody offered him a seat. Nobody smiled. Victoria looked at him the way she looked at spreadsheets when the numbers did not add up. Directly, without hostility, but without warmth, either pure analytical attention. "Who authorized your access to that terminal?" she asked. "Nobody," Elias said. "My badge opens the server room for cleaning. The terminal wasn't locked. I used what was available." "You modified a live production environment monitoring configuration," Marcus said. He was trying to sound measured. But there was heat underneath it. "On a system with $300 million in active contracts. I wrote a routing buffer to the secondary optimization module through the diagnostics interface," Elias said. "I didn't touch the production codebase. What I did was equivalent to manually adjusting a valve while the pipe is leaking. You still need to replace the pipe, but now you have time to do it without flooding the floor." Silence. Marcus opened his mouth. Victoria held up one finger, and Marcus closed it. She was looking at Elias with an expression that had shifted, still precise, still guarded, but something behind it had changed. The spreadsheet had produced a number that did not fit the model, and Victoria Hale did not dismiss numbers that did not fit the model. She examined them. "You're going to explain exactly what you did," she said, "and why." She turned toward the whiteboard mounted on the side wall and handed him a marker. Elias stood in front of the whiteboard for a moment. He had not stood at a whiteboard in front of a room full of engineers in 2 years. His hands were steadier than he expected. He began at the top the architecture of Atlas's load-balancing logic as best as he could reconstruct it from the monitoring data he had reviewed. He drew the primary module. He drew the optimization patch and its integration point. He drew the timing intervals, the safety check cycle, and the exact millisecond window in which the two processes collided under high-load conditions. He labeled each component with the precision of someone who had spent a decade drawing these diagrams on whiteboards and in design documents, and in his own head at 2 a.m. when he could not sleep. Nobody interrupted. He drew the buffer sequence he had implemented and explained why it was structurally safe as a temporary measure and what permanent solution it was pointing toward. He circled the integration point in red and wrote next to it in block letters. "This is where the actual fix lives." When he finished and turned back to the room, one of the engineers against the back wall, a woman in her late 30s named Sandra Okafor, a senior member of the Atlas team, was looking at the board with an expression of quiet, slightly uncomfortable recognition. She had been one of the people working the 72-hour rotation. She had been looking at the primary module. She had not looked at the optimization patch. "He's right," she said. She was not addressing anyone in particular. She was addressing the whiteboard. "The timing conflict in the secondary routine, we didn't check that layer because the patch was performance only. We assumed it was clean." She paused. "He's right." The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Victoria was watching Elias. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked. "Vantex Technologies," he said. "I was lead systems engineer for 9 years. I designed energy routing automation for industrial facilities. Wrote the base documentation for their fault tolerance protocol. Vantex filed a misconduct notation against you," Marcus said carefully. He had clearly run the background check. "Yes," Elias said. "And you're mopping floors." "Yes." Another silence. Victoria was still watching him. She had not moved from her position beside the window, and the morning light behind her made her expression harder to read. But her voice when she spoke again was different, not softer exactly, but more considered. "I want to understand the Vantex incident," she said. "So do I," Elias said. "I have for 2 years. What followed was not a comfortable conversation. It was a factual one. Elias laid out the timeline of the Vantex modification, the original system design, his written objections, the timestamp on the vice president's revision, the cascade failure, the investigation. He presented it the way he always had, in his own mind, as a sequence of events with a clear causal structure, even if the causal structure had cost him everything. Victoria listened without interruption. When he finished, she did not offer sympathy. She offered something more useful, a question. "Do you have copies of the objection memos?" "Yes," he said. On a personal drive at home, she looked at Marcus. Then she looked back at Elias. It took her 3 seconds to make the decision that most people in her position would have spent a week deliberating. That was another thing about Victoria Hale. She did not confuse deliberation with caution. When the data was sufficient, she moved. The challenge came the following Wednesday. By then, word had traveled through the engineering team in the way that significant things travel through close-knit technical groups, not through formal communication, but through the specific electric hum of people processing something they cannot quite categorize. The cleaning guy had fixed the loop. The cleaning guy had explained the fix on a whiteboard, and Sandra Okafor had said he was right. Nobody knew who he was or where he had come from or why he was holding a mop. Victoria gathered the full Atlas team in the main development lab on 4714 engineers, 2 project managers, Marcus, and brought Elias in without introduction. She stood at the front of the room and said, without preamble, "Atlas has a permanent fix available. Before I reassign team resources to implement it, I want to see it done in a live environment. You have the floor." She was looking at Elias. The room knew, in that moment, what this was. It was a test, not a formality, not a courtesy, a real, unstructured, consequential test. With the entire team watching and the production system live and a demonstration deadline 6 weeks out. Elias stood at the primary development workstation. He was still in his gray coveralls. He looked at the screen for a long moment, and in that moment the only person who knew this was him. He thought about Lily. He thought about the way she had said 3 nights ago when he was putting her to bed, "Dad, do you think your new job will get better?" And he had said, "I think it might," and she had nodded with the gravity of a person filing a report. He pulled up the Atlas codebase. The system had restabilized after his temporary fix, but the underlying fault remained. Over the past 4 days, the load had been artificially reduced to prevent a recurrence, which meant the system was running at reduced capacity, not an acceptable state for a platform that needed to demonstrate full load performance in 6 weeks. He began in the optimization patch. He pulled the module into a side-by-side view with the primary load balancing code and traced the timing architecture forward from the integration point, looking for the exact interaction chain that produced the conflict. It was there nested 3 levels deep in a conditional loop that ran only during peak load simulation. He found it in 7 minutes. The permanent fix required restructuring how the optimization routine communicated its timing state to the primary module, not rewriting it, but inserting a state synchronization checkpoint at the integration point that allowed both processes to confirm readiness before proceeding. It was a 10-line change to the routing logic. It was elegant in the way that true solutions are elegant, not because it was clever, but because it was correct. He wrote it cleanly. He documented each line as he went. Not because anyone asked him to, but because that was how he had always worked. He ran the static analysis. He ran the simulation at 40% load, then 60, then 80, then full. The Atlas system ran. Not just stably better than it had run at any point in the previous 8 months, because the timing conflict that had been causing the loop had also been causing a minor but measurable inefficiency in the load balancing cycle under normal conditions. With the synchronization checkpoint in place, the system's response latency dropped by 11%. Elias took his hands off the keyboard and stepped back. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment that lasted long enough to be felt. Sandra Okafor spoke first, her voice quiet. 11% latency reduction. That's going to show in the demo metrics. Marcus Webb was looking at the performance readout with an expression that had moved past discomfort into something closer to reckoning. He had been the one who wanted Elias removed from the building the Monday he was brought in. He was not the kind of person who apologized easily, but he was the kind of person who understood data, and the data in front of him did not leave room for the position he had been defending. Victoria was standing at the side of the room. She had not moved during the entire demonstration. Now she straightened slightly and walked to the center workstation and looked at the performance monitor for a long, quiet moment. Then she turned to Elias. "Come to my office," she said. The offer was written by the time they sat down. Victoria did not believe in letting clarity wait for formality. The document on her desk described a position. Senior Systems Architect, Atlas Division. Base compensation 11 times his current cleaning salary. Full benefits, equity participation, direct reporting line to her office. Elias read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at her. "I want the Vantex record reviewed," he said, formally. "I want the misconduct notation challenged." Victoria had anticipated this. She had spent part of the previous evening reviewing employment law in Washington state and the specific protocols governing professional misconduct notations in the engineering sector. "I have a legal team," she said. "If your documentation supports the timeline you described, we can initiate a formal challenge. It will take months. It may not be clean." "I know," Elias said. "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to look at the documents. That's all I'm asking." She studied him for a moment. "You could take the offer and pursue the Vantex matter privately." "I could," he said. "But I need to know that the two things aren't separate. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to look at it. To acknowledge it's worth looking at." Victoria was quiet for a moment that Elias had learned, over the past week, to read as the external signal of her thinking rather than her uncertainty. "My legal team will have the documents reviewed within 30 days, she said. "If your account is corroborated, Ardent will provide formal documentation of the timeline discrepancy to the Washington State Engineering Board. That documentation carries weight." Elias looked at her. Then he picked up the pen. The months that followed were not cinematic. They were the kind of months that matter more than cinematic ones. Long, incremental, built from work and patience, and small daily acts of competence that accumulate the way water carves stone. Elias moved into the Atlas architect role the same week the engineering team began integrating his permanent fix into the platform's core architecture. He worked in the same building he had cleaned, on the same floor where someone had once told him the server room was not his concern. He wore different clothes now. He still knew where the mop closet was. The Vantex review took 4 months. It was not a simple process. The legal team Ardent assigned to it was thorough, and Garrett Moss's original revision of the internal reports had been done with enough technical sophistication to require expert analysis to unravel. But the timestamp discrepancies Elias had flagged were real, and the metadata on the original objection memos was intact, and the pattern that emerged from a full reconstruction of the document trail was unambiguous to anyone with the expertise to read it. The Washington State Engineering Board received Ardent's documentation in late March. The formal review process that followed was institutional and slow and not, in the end, dramatic. What it produced was a correction notice. The misconduct notation in Elias Carter's professional record was reclassified as unsubstantiated and removed. Garrett Moss, whose conduct during the original investigation was found to have materially violated Vantex's own internal ethics protocol, resigned from his current position at another firm before the board completed its review. The resignation was described in a 2-sentence industry newsletter item that most people in the field read and moved past quickly. Elias read it on a Tuesday morning at his desk on the 47th floor and sat with it for a few minutes. He did not feel the satisfaction he had imagined. The clean, bright burst of vindication he had constructed in his mind during the long months of apartment hunting and resume, sending and orange envelope power bills. What he felt instead was something quieter and more structural, not triumph, but restoration. The record now said what was true. That was what he had asked for. It was, it turned out, enough. The Atlas Live demonstration happened on a Thursday in early May, in a conference room on the 48th floor, with 12 representatives from 4 municipal infrastructure clients and a camera crew from a trade publication. The system performed at 104% of its projected baseline. The latency metrics, including the 11% improvement Elias's fix had introduced, were presented as a feature. 3 of the 4 clients signed letters of intent before the end of the day. Victoria shook hands with each of them. She did not look across the room at Elias, but after the last client had left and the catering staff was clearing the coffee service, she paused beside his chair on her way out and said, without stopping, "The metrics held." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. From Victoria Hale, it was the same thing. 6 months into his role, Elias had become, by the quiet consensus of the Atlas team, the person you brought the problems that weren't fitting the available frameworks. Not because he was the most credentialed person in the room, he wasn't, anymore, in a traditional sense, but because he had a quality that credential alone cannot manufacture. The ability to look at a complex and apparently intractable problem and locate, without drama, the place where it was actually broken. Sandra Okafor, who had become his closest collaborator on the team, described it to a colleague once as structural intuition. She said it the way engineers say things when they are being imprecise on purpose, because the precise word hasn't been coined yet. Lily came to the office for the first time on a Friday afternoon in late May, at the end of the school week, because Elias's after-school pickup was running late and the building's front desk had a standing note that she was to be brought up to the 47th floor. She arrived with her backpack and her serious expression and sat in the chair beside his desk eating a granola bar while he finished a review session with 2 junior engineers. Victoria Hale walked past the open office door on her way to the elevator and stopped. Elias saw her from across the room. He had become, over 6 months of daily professional proximity, reasonably skilled at reading Victoria's reactions, at distinguishing her calculating stillness from her curious stillness, her critical assessment from her provisional approval. What he saw on her face in the doorway, looking at Lily, was none of these. It was simpler and less guarded than anything he had seen from her in the preceding months. It was surprise, and underneath the surprise, something genuine and unperformed. Victoria walked into the office and crouched down to Lily's level, an unself-conscious, entirely natural movement that seemed to catch both of them slightly off guard. "You must be Lily," she said. Lily looked at her with the clear, evaluating attention of a child who has learned not to waste it. "You're the boss," Lily said. "Yes," Victoria said. "Dad told me about you." Lily considered this for a moment. "He said you're very good at your job." Victoria looked briefly at Elias, who had the expression of a person actively not smiling. She looked back at Lily. "Your father is very good at his job," she said. Lily nodded, with the patient confirmation of someone whose point has finally been acknowledged. "I know," she said. "I told you he was." Victoria stayed crouched for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she straightened and looked at Elias again, and this time the expression was something he did not have a category for, yet something that was not professional assessment or structural analysis or any of the registers he had come to associate with her. It was quiet and direct and a little unguarded, and it stayed there for 2 seconds longer than efficiency required. She said, "Good work this week," and walked out. Elias watched her go. He looked at Lily. Lily was eating her granola bar with the composure of someone who had made her point and was content to let events proceed. On the last Friday of that month, after the building had quieted and most of the team had gone home, Elias walked through the 47th floor on his way to the elevator. He passed the server room. The indicator board behind the door was solid green, a color that had not been simple or guaranteed when he had first seen it through the gap in a door with a mop in his hand. He still had the gray coveralls. He had folded them and put them on the shelf in the back of his closet, behind his coats, where he could find them easily. He was not entirely sure why. He had thought about it a few times. The way you think about things that carry more weight than they should for reasons you understand but cannot quite articulate. He thought it had something to do with Lily telling him, on the Tuesday after the demonstration, over dinner at their kitchen table in the smaller apartment they had not yet moved out of, "Dad, I want to see where you work now. Not your new job or the office. Where you work now," as if the location of his working had become a thing of interest, a landmark worth orienting toward. He stood in the hallway and looked at the green board through the small window in the server room door and did not feel triumphant about any of it. He felt, and this was the correct word, the precise word, the one he would have reached for if anyone had asked restored. The same way the system on the other side of that door had been restored. Not to the state it was before the fault, but to a better state. A more honest architecture, one where the hidden conflict had been found and named and corrected. He pressed the elevator button and waited. Down in the lobby, through the glass, the city was doing what cities do at the end of a Friday. Dispersing, regrouping, carrying its people home through the amber and blue of the early evening. He watched it for a moment. Then the elevator arrived and the doors opened, and he got in. He was not the cleaning guy anymore. He had not forgotten, either, how it felt to be.